Wasabi guys, glad to be back with another 10 underrated commander cards. If you're unfamiliar with the series, basically what I do is I take 10 cards that in my own personal opinion I feel these cards are underrated in the commander format. They could see some more play. So let's start it off here with the first one on this list, and that is Tangle Wire, the hilarious card. It's 3 mana artifact, enters the battlefield with 4 fading counters. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a fade counter from it. If you can't, sacrifice it, but at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player taps an untapped artifact, creature, or land he or she controls for each fade counter on Tangle Wire. This card is super effective in resource denial based decks, which are usually stacks decks. Any sort of way to keep your opponents from using their mana is preferable, and while this does eventually go away, in the ideal situation with stacks decks, you want to be able to get the upper hand without your opponents being able to respond, and the best way to do that is to tap them down of their resources. This also has the benefit of hurting their mana. It's a fantastic hate card. It's not incredibly oppressive though, it does eventually go away, but the idea here is to do what you do before it goes away. And then the next card we have is Impermanence Anvil. It has the imprint on it, so you exile a non-land card with it, and cards that you cast that share a card type, so card type being artifact, creature, enchantment, planeswalker, stuff like that, those cost 2 generic mana less than they normally would, which is fantastic. This is probably the most underrated card on this entire list, if I had to say so, just because we have a ton of mana ramp and people also put a ton of importance on ramping up, whether it's getting colorless mana or colored mana. This is just fantastic because cost reduction kind of does that in its own way. It's not always going to be preferable. You have some cards that just don't have the generic mana in the mana cost, so they're a little bit trickier to cast, but for most decks, this is fantastic, especially ones that are primarily artifact, primarily enchantment, primarily creature. It's going to put in that much work, and I think cost reduction, if you apply it into just about every single deck, it's never a bad thing. So the fact that this is on a colorless 3 mana artifact, it's going to do a lot of good things. And then the next card we have is the newest card on this list from Ixalan, Ashes of the Abhorrent. Players can't cast spells from graveyards or activate abilities of cards in graveyards, and whenever a creature dies, you gain 1 life. So one of my favorite cards from that whole set. I think it's fantastic, but I haven't seen it a lot in the format. I don't see it being played that much. It's a perfect hate card, and I know a lot of people, very similar to Tangle Wire, they want to stay away from hate cards. They don't want to be public enemy number 1, but this card is just pure value. It's just 2 mana, you get a consistent way to gain life because creatures are going to die all the time, and players can't cast spells from graveyards or activate abilities from graveyards. So this shuts down flashback type of effects, activated abilities such as Unearth. So cards like Snapcaster Mage, Cedrus are extremely useless against this card. And of course, the added benefit of gaining a ton of life is never a bad thing in Commander. So overall, I think if you haven't given this card a shot yet, check it out, see if it fits in your white decks. It's a pretty good card. Next we have Magus of the Bazaar. Now it's basically the Magus version of Bazaar Baghdad from Arabian Nights. It's also one of the most powerful cards in the entire game, but it is also significantly better because it is in land form and you can pretty much do it right off the bat. Whereas with Magus of the Bazaar, it is just a 2 mana creature, easier to get rid of, and in Commander, where speed isn't necessarily the biggest priority, it's not going to put in that much power when it comes to card draw. But when you have the graveyard manipulation that this card offers in a format where there are a ton of graveyard synergies, that cannot be ignored, especially if you have a commander that doesn't really care about the difference between your hand and your graveyard, such as the Mimeoplasm, Tastic, or the Golden Fang. Decks like that where your graveyard manipulation is just so easy, you can take advantage of it. Just a fantastic card, and I'm surprised I haven't seen this more often. Give it a shot in your blue decks. Then the next card we have is Plaques Manta. For 2 mana in blue, you can play Plaques Mana anytime you could play an instant, and when Plaques Mana comes into play, creatures you control can't be targets of spells or abilities this turn. So basically gives all of your creatures Shroud. And when Plaques Mana comes into play, sacrifice it unless green was spent to play it. So obviously you can only play this in decks playing both blue and green, and even if you don't use the green for the other mana in the mana cost, it's still going to put in some work there. At instant speed, you can give all your creatures Shroud until end end of turn. There aren't too many cards that offer this type of utility. You have certain cards that can make your creatures indestructible until end of turn. However, giving Shroud just means that your opponents can't really target them with exile removal, which is very problematic for a lot of good creatures in the format. So it's a pretty simple card, and I usually like flash as a keyword. You get a creature also. I just like the utility. And then we have Trench Gorger. This guy is fantastic. Originally printed in the first Commander set for 8 mana. You get a 6/6 Trampler, but when Trench Gorger enters the battlefield, you get to search your library for any number of land cards, exile them, and then shuffle your library. If you do, his power and toughness each become equal to the number of cards exiled this way. This is fantastic. The big problem with creatures that just get gigantic is that they usually don't have any other keywords. Well, this has trample. So it stands aside from Lord of Extinction, those types of cards where they can get pretty big, but they don't have trample or any form of evasion so that they can deal damage pretty easy. But with this card, you also have the added benefit of taking out all the land cards that you no longer want to draw from your deck. Some people might view that as being pretty risky, but at a certain point in the game, you have to understand, maybe I don't need any more lands for my deck. Maybe 10 lands is enough. So you guarantee yourself that if you get rid of the rest of the lands in your deck, that all you're going to be drawing is non-land cards, just pure gas. That's all you're going to be drawing for the rest of the game. I don't think there are too many cards that can guarantee you that. We do have cards like Sensei's Divining Top to where you can manipulate the top card of your library to where hopefully you don't draw into lands, but there are many situations with cards like that to where the top 3 cards are lands and you're pretty much just screwed. This guarantees you that you don't dead draw any lands. Fantastic card. Doesn't see enough play in the format. It is a whopping 8 mana, but once you get it out, it's a huge creature with trample, likely the biggest threat on the board. And then we have Coffin Queen. Very similar to the Marique Reberet creature. I don't know how to say her name. It's very weird, but it has the whole thing where you can choose to not untap her, but whenever you do, the creature that you bring back from the graveyard exiles. So it's very similar, but instead of gaining control of your opponent's creatures, you are bringing a creature back from a graveyard. So I shouldn't really have to say this too often, but graveyard manipulation is always amazing in Commander. We have a ton of good recursion cards. This is just a 3 mana creature with an activated ability that's pretty solid. We have a lot of one and done spells that just kind of put in their work there. They bring back maybe a few creatures, and that's about it. But with this, you can do this over and over again. You don't have to keep it tapped down to hold on to that creature. If you want to, just to kind of mess with your opponents, you can just untap it to exile that creature. So it kind of doubles as graveyard hate. So pretty versatile card. I like the manipulation. I like the control aspect as well. And then we have Holistic Wisdom. 3 mana green enchantment with an activated ability of 2. Remove a card in your hand from the game to return target card from your graveyard to your hand if it shares a type with the card removed this way. Obviously this includes Planeswalker, although it doesn't say it in the reminder text. So we know that it pretty much just includes all different card types. So if you're playing a Planeswalker deck, you can exile a bad Planeswalker from your hand for a better one in your graveyard to be returned. If you're playing an enchantment deck, you can do the same thing with enchantments, the same thing with creatures and artifacts. Pretty fantastic. I mean, we have cards that return creatures and other cards from your graveyard to your hand. This is a card that can do it repeatedly for just the 2 mana and the activated ability. The only downside being is that you have to exile a resource from your hand to get one back from your graveyard, so it's not pure value, it's not pure advantage. But if you have a dead hand, if you have a terrible creature in your hand, why not remove it, get your better creature back from your graveyard? It's definitely something to consider if you're playing green, and we do have cards like Eternal Witness that can get us cards back from our graveyard to our hand, but unless we can flicker it, can't really get much else out of it. So that's why I really like this card. And then we have Vizier of the Menagerie from Amonkhet, very similar to Oracle of Moldiah. The only difference being is that it's basically for creatures, and instead of having to reveal the top card of your library, you just get to look at it at any time you want to. And any creatures that you play, you can use any mana to cast them, so there's a huge benefit. Throw this into a multicolor creature deck, and it's just pure value. And always, whenever you're able to play the top card of your library, especially when considering the comparison to Oracle of Moldiah and how much work that card puts into a lot of good control decks, this also helps speed up your creature decks, and it's usually what you're going to throw it into anyway. It's an obvious inclusion into an Animar deck for that reason. Creature decks are still pretty powerful, and this card offers a lot of consistency to that deck type. So if you're playing a good creature-based deck, this is definitely a card you want to consider. I absolutely love it. And then the last card we have is Ghoul Tree. Now, not really fantastic, not really something that you're going to see a lot of, but There are a lot of good graveyard-based decks, and this card is definitely interesting. It's not going to overwhelm you, it doesn't have any good keywords, but what it does have is incredible cost reduction. It costs 1 less for each creature card in your graveyard, and yes, that is very specific, so you have to be playing a sort of graveyard synergistic deck to where you can mill yourself out, or something like Marin of Clan Neltoth to where you have a ton of creatures in your graveyard already. So ideally, you want to pay 1 green mana to play this, and it's a 10/10. No big deal, just a 10/10 for 1 green mana, best case scenario. Even if it's a little bit more than 1 green mana, it's still pretty good value for a 10/10. And yes, while it doesn't have your keywords for evasion, what it does end up offering you is a pretty decent sized body, and it's not like it's impossible to then equip and give keywords that way. So while it is at first very underwhelming, once you throw it into decks where power and toughness can be used to an advantage, such as the Mimeoplasm, you can put counters on Mimeoplasm by exiling this card for its power and toughness. It doesn't do anything else, it's a 10/10, but cost reduction, mana efficiency is still a thing. So anyway guys, let me know what you think about these 10 underrated commander cards. Let me know which ones are your favorite. Let me know what cards you think are underrated. Definitely like to hear your guys' input in the comment section below. Anyway, you all have a wonderful day. Void here signing off.